Elias Grant had lived alone on his small ranch for so many years that silence had become his closest companion. He had grown used to quiet mornings, slow days, and long nights where only the wind answered him back. Most days were simple: checking fences, feeding his horse, fixing whatever broke, and making sure his land stayed in good shape. He didn't mind the loneliness. Life had taught him that peace sometimes came with distance. Still, every now and then, he wished for a voice other than his own echo in the barn. He wished for something unexpected, something that reminded him he was still part of the living world. One cold evening, when the sky was turning darker than usual and clouds were closing in low, Elias walked to his barn with a lantern in one hand and a coat pulled tight around his shoulders. The wind was sharp, carrying dust and a sense of something unsettled. He had gone out there only to check if the animals were calm before the weather turned worse. But the moment he opened the barn door, he felt something strange in the air, like a soft, hidden breath waiting inside. At first, he thought it was just the wind pushing behind him, but then he heard it again, a tiny sound, softer than a whisper, almost like the faint cry of someone trying not to be heard. Elias stopped walking. His lantern swung gently in his grip, sending long shadows crawling across the hay bales and wooden beams. He listened closely. The sound came again, weak and trembling. Elias slowly stepped forward. "Anyone in here?" he asked gently, not wanting to scare whoever or whatever was hiding. His voice echoed back at him. But no answer came, only the soft wheeze of someone struggling to breathe. He moved the lantern toward the far corner of the barn, behind stacked hay bales that hadn't been touched in weeks. As he leaned down and pushed some hay aside, his heart jumped. There, curled up like a wounded bird, was a child, thin, cold, and barely awake. The small face was pale with hunger, and the child's long hair was tangled and dusty. The clothes looked worn, stretched from long travel, and the little hands were trembling from weakness. Elias knelt slowly, lowering himself so he didn't appear threatening. "Hey there," he said softly, the way a man speaks when he wants to calm a scared animal. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The child flinched at the sound and tried to push away, but there wasn't enough strength to move. Elias could see fear in the dark eyes staring back at him, fear mixed with exhaustion so heavy that the child seemed close to passing out. He knew right away that the child must have wandered far without food or shelter. A child that small didn't reach this condition overnight. "Easy," Elias whispered. "I'm going to help you, all right? You're safe here." The child blinked slowly, as if unsure whether to believe him. Elias took off his coat and wrapped it around the small body. The child was freezing. Elias carried warm blankets to the corner and gently lifted the child into them. He moved with care, afraid that even a strong grip might hurt. When he brought a cup of water close to the child's lips, the small hands reached out desperately, though still shaking. "Not too fast," Elias murmured as he helped the child sip. "There you go. Little by little." After a few careful sips, the child rested again, breathing a little steadier. Elias found some soft bread in his bag and tore small pieces. The child ate slowly at first, then with growing hunger. Elias could see ribs through the shirt fabric, and it hurt him to imagine how long the child had been alone. When the child's breathing calmed, Elias tried speaking again. "Can you tell me your name?" For a moment, he thought the child wouldn't answer. Then a soft, breathy voice whispered, "Talon." The name carried a quiet strength, like it came from someone who belonged to open land and strong people. Elias nodded gently. "All right, Talon. You're safe now. You're going to be fine." But Talon suddenly looked toward the barn door with fear, eyes wide as if expecting someone or something to appear. Elias followed the gaze but saw nothing outside except darkness and drifting dust. "You don't want to go to town?" Elias asked. Talon shook his head quickly, fear tightening in his expression. "All right," Elias whispered. "We'll stay here tonight." He didn't press for answers. A child in this state had already been through enough. What mattered now was keeping him safe. Elias carried Talon into the warmest corner of the barn, set up extra blankets, and lit 2 lanterns nearby so the darkness wouldn't feel too heavy. Talon slowly relaxed, though every now and then his eyes drifted toward the barn door like he feared something coming. Elias sat beside him, leaning against a beam, staying close enough to reassure him without making him uncomfortable. As the night deepened, the wind grew colder. The barn creaked softly, and the lantern light flickered on the walls. Talon eventually drifted into a deep sleep, his breathing gentle and steady. Elias didn't sleep. He watched over the child, checking his temperature, making sure the blankets stayed wrapped. Every few minutes he checked the door, listening to the strange tension in the air. Something about the night felt heavier than usual, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Hours passed slowly. Elias pulled another blanket around himself, but the cold didn't bother him much. What kept him awake was a mixture of responsibility and worry. Whoever Talon belonged to must be searching desperately for him. A child doesn't survive alone for long, not without family, not without protection. Near dawn, when the sky shifted from black to a soft gray, Elias heard a low, steady sound in the distance. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it grew. Soft drum beats, slow and rhythmic, carried across the morning air. They were far away, but unmistakable. Elias had lived out here long enough to recognize the sound. These were not random noises. They were signals. Talon stirred in his sleep, as if he heard them too. Elias stepped outside the barn slowly, the cold air hitting his face sharply, and then he froze. All across the open land, stretching from his fence line to the distant ridge, stood warriors, rows and rows of them, silent and still like statues carved from the earth, spears, bows, and horses. Faces calm but watchful. Their presence filled the land like a quiet storm ready to break. There weren't 10, not 50. At least 200 stood there, unmoving, waiting. Elias felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. The child he saved wasn't just any lost traveler. Talon belonged to people who would cross the land for him, people who had clearly spent hours searching, people who now stood outside Elias's barn, watching every breath he took. He understood then that the night was only the beginning. What happened next depended on one thing, whether these warriors believed he had saved the child or harmed him. Elias took a slow breath, steadying himself. Inside the barn, Talon slept peacefully. Outside, 200 warriors waited for sunrise, and Elias stood alone between both worlds, knowing the next moments could change his life forever. Elias stood still for a long moment, unable to move as the early morning light slowly spread across the land. The warriors didn't shout, didn't raise their weapons, didn't move an inch. They simply watched him, 200 steady eyes locked on a single cowboy standing outside his barn. The cold air felt sharper than before, and Elias could hear his own heartbeat louder than anything else. He swallowed hard, knowing one wrong step could send the wrong message. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't raise his hands in fear either. He simply stood calm, hoping calmness would travel farther than any words. The soft drum beats stopped. Silence settled over the ranch so deeply that even the wind seemed to pause. Then the barn door behind him creaked lightly. A small voice whispered, "They came." Talon had woken and stepped closer, his small hand clutching the blanket around his shoulders. His eyes were filled with both relief and fear. Relief because he recognized his people. Fear because he didn't know how they would react when they saw him standing beside a stranger. Elias turned to him gently. "Stay behind me a little," he whispered. "No one will hurt you here." But Talon shook his head. "They need to see I am safe." The bravery of that small child surprised Elias. Talon stepped forward, though he was still weak, and stood beside the cowboy. The moment he did, a shift rippled across the army of warriors. They straightened slightly, as if unable to believe what they were seeing. Then one man stepped ahead of the rest, a tall figure with strong shoulders, long hair tied behind his head, and a stern expression that looked carved from stone. His steps were slow, firm, confident. Not a single warrior behind him moved. They allowed him to approach alone, a clear sign he was the leader. Elias didn't step away. He waited, standing with Talon close at his side. When the man finally reached a few steps away, he stopped. His deep voice carried across the cold air. "I am Running Hawk," he said, "chief of the people who search for this child." His eyes moved to Talon, and for the first time the sternness melted slightly. "Grandson, we feared we had lost you." Elias felt a quiet shock. Grandson? Talon wasn't just part of the tribe. He was part of the chief's own family. That explained the massive search party, the fear in the warriors' eyes, the long night of drumbeats echoing across the land. Talon took a timid step forward. "Grandfather," he whispered, his voice shaky with emotion. Running Hawk closed the distance in 2 strong steps and knelt down to wrap his arms around the boy. The child pressed his face into his grandfather's shoulder, holding on tightly. The chief stayed that way for a long moment, breathing slowly, steadying himself. He didn't cry, but the emotion was clear in the way his hands trembled slightly as he held Talon. Then Running Hawk stood up again, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder as he turned to Elias. "You found my grandson," he said. "You gave him shelter." Elias nodded. "He was starving, weak. I did what anyone should do." The chief looked at him for a long moment. "Not everyone would have helped," he said quietly. "Many would have turned away. Some would have feared him. But you protected him." His gaze drifted to the barn, noticing the lanterns still burning. "You stayed awake through the night for him." Elias didn't know how to respond to such heavy gratitude, so he simply nodded again. Behind the chief, more of the warriors began to move forward, though slowly and without aggression. They came closer to see Talon clearly, confirming he was alive and safe. Some murmured softly among themselves, their faces softening with relief. They didn't approach Elias aggressively. Rather, they studied him with curious respect. One warrior knelt and touched the dust with his hand, whispering something in his language, likely a prayer of thanks. Another looked at Elias's barn and nodded to himself, as if realizing the cowboy had done far more than anyone else would have. Running Hawk turned toward his people. "He lives because of this man," he said aloud, making sure every warrior heard it clearly. "Remember this." Those words carried weight far beyond simple thanks. Elias could feel it. He understood that among these people, gratitude wasn't spoken lightly. It was spoken as a promise. Still, the tension wasn't fully gone. The warriors began setting up a temporary camp right outside his ranch, their movements careful but firm. They built fires, set up shelters, and created clear boundaries around the area, almost as though protecting their chief and grandson from any danger that might still be nearby. Talon stayed beside Elias, refusing to move even when other warriors tried to bring him food or a blanket. He looked up at Elias with quiet trust, as if the cowboy had become a safe place in his young world. "You want to stay by me?" Elias asked softly. Talon nodded. "You helped me. You stayed awake. Grandfather trusts you, and so do I." The words warmed Elias more than the morning sun ever could. Running Hawk watched the interaction with a thoughtful gaze. Later, when the morning settled and fires began warming the camp, the chief approached Elias again. There were signs, Running Hawk said quietly. Tracks of trouble near our land. We feared he was taken. He studied the cowboy closely. But I see now he ran from fear, not from us. And you found him before the cold did. Elias took a slow breath. He was scared when I found him. He didn't want me to take him to town. Seemed like someone might be after him. Running Hawk's jaw tightened. There are those who would harm our people to spark trouble, some who wish to break the peace. He looked around the land. That is why we searched with so many warriors. Elias nodded. It made sense now. The land had been tense for months. Rumors had spread. Mistakes had sparked anger. A lost child could have turned into something far worse if found by someone with bad intentions. The chief continued. But he is safe. Because of you. Elias glanced at Talon again, who was now eating warm food while watching him carefully. He's a strong boy, Elias said. He made it far. Running Hawk smiled a rare, soft smile. He is strong, he agreed, but even the strongest child needs someone kind to lift them up. More time passed. The warriors built a protective ring around the ranch, not to threaten Elias, but to guard Talon. They offered Elias food from their fires. Some nodded to him with respect each time he walked by. Even the horses seemed calmer. Talon never left his side, always staying close, always looking at Elias like he was more than a stranger, like he was a friend who had stepped into his life at the perfect moment. By afternoon, the chief made a decision. You will come to our camp tonight, Running Hawk said, as a guest. You will sit with us. You will hear our voices, and we will hear yours. A man who saves a child is a man welcomed by our fire. Elias felt a weight lift from his chest. He knew acceptance like this wasn't something given easily. It meant safety. It meant trust. It meant connection between two worlds that rarely crossed paths without tension. Thank you, he said sincerely. I'll come. Running Hawk nodded once. Good. Tonight we share peace. Elias looked across the land at the hundreds of warriors, the fires, the calm movement of people. What had started as a quiet night had become a day that changed everything. The bond that had formed between him and Talon wasn't small. It wasn't temporary. It felt like something deeper. Something that might reshape the entire relationship between him and the people who lived beyond the distant ridge. And as the sun lowered toward the horizon, Elias realized he wasn't standing alone anymore. 200 warriors watched over the land. A child trusted him completely, and a chief had offered him something no cowboy expected: friendship. Running Hawk kept his promise. When evening settled over the land and the sky turned a warm orange, one of the warriors approached Elias with a respectful nod, silently inviting him to follow them toward the camp. It felt strange to walk through a group of 200 warriors. But the surprising part was that none of them glared or showed any anger. They simply watched him, calm, steady, and curious. Elias felt Talon walking close beside him, still holding the blanket Elias had wrapped around him the night before. Talon didn't leave his side for even a second. Every few steps, the child would glance up as if checking that Elias was truly there. The connection between them felt natural, almost like it had been there much longer than a single day. The camp was alive with movement. Fires burned in circles, giving off warm light. Women were preparing food, warriors were tending to horses, and elders were sitting together speaking quietly. But the moment Elias entered, a soft hush rolled across the area. Not fear, not anger, just a respectful curiosity. They knew this was the man who had saved their chief's grandson, the child who was future blood of their people. Running Hawk stood at the center of the largest fire circle. His voice carried across the camp as he called out something in his language, and instantly everyone settled down. Talon pulled Elias gently toward the place beside the chief, a seat of honor. Elias hesitated a moment. He wasn't used to sitting anywhere important. But Talon tugged his hand until he finally took the seat. The fire crackled warmly as the circle gathered. Running Hawk looked around at his people before speaking. "Tonight we give thanks," he said in slow, clear words so Elias could understand. "Not only because our grandson has returned, but because a stranger with no reason to help chose to give what we could not reach in time." Elias looked down modestly, not comfortable with being praised. "I only did what anyone should do," he murmured. The chief shook his head. "Not everyone would. Some would fear, some would walk away." He placed his hand gently on Talon's shoulder. "This child saw kindness, not fear, and for that, we honor you." Elias didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded with quiet respect. Food was passed around, warm dishes made from corn, vegetables, and lean meat. Elias accepted them gratefully. Talon, sitting against his side, ate happily, more energetic than he had been earlier. Now that he was fed and surrounded by people he trusted, his eyes shone with life again. After everyone finished eating, Running Hawk leaned closer to Elias. "It is time you know the truth of why he was lost," he said. Elias listened carefully. Talon had been traveling with a group of young scouts when a sudden storm swept across the land. The wind was fierce, the rain blinding. The scouts scattered in confusion, and Talon, being younger than the rest, couldn't keep up. When the storm passed, he was nowhere to be found. The tribe searched for him all night, but found only uncertain tracks that led toward the boundary between their territory and the land where settlers lived. The chief continued in a quieter voice. "There were those who tried to take advantage of this moment. They spread rumors that our people had crossed into settler land to take something. They wanted trouble between us." Elias nodded slowly. He had heard whispers in town, fear, suspicion, anger. Just like the chief said, people ready to believe the worst. Running Hawk's voice dropped even lower, heavy with concern. "If anyone else had found Talon first, someone who feared us, someone who wanted conflict, this land would not be peaceful tonight." He looked directly into Elias's eyes. "But you found him. You saved him. You changed what could have happened." Elias felt the weight of those words. He didn't think of himself as someone who could change history. He was just a lonely cowboy living on a small ranch, doing his best to get through each day. But somehow, by helping a lost child, he had stepped into something much bigger. Talon spoke softly beside him. "I thought I was going to be alone forever," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was scared. The night was so cold, I couldn't walk anymore. Then you found me." Elias placed a gentle hand on the child's back. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You weren't alone. Not anymore." The boy leaned into him a little, finding comfort in the calm tone. Running Hawk watched the two with deep thought in his eyes. "My people value loyalty, strength, courage," he said, "but kindness. Kindness is the rarest strength. You showed that strength when no one was watching." The chief reached into a small pouch tied at his side and pulled out a carved wooden piece. It was smooth, shaped carefully by hand, and marked with a symbol that resembled a rising sun over a mountain. "This is a mark of honor among my people," Running Hawk said. "It is not given lightly, but tonight we give it to you." Elias stared at it, not sure he deserved something so important. "I don't know if I didn't do it for a reward." "We know that," the chief replied. "That is why you deserve it." Talon took the carved piece carefully and placed it in Elias's hand with both of his small hands, as if giving him something precious. "Grandfather says this is for those who protect without asking," Talon whispered. "So it is yours." Elias's chest tightened with emotion he rarely felt. He closed his hand slowly around the carved symbol. "Thank you," he said softly. The chief nodded once. Sharp, respectful, final. The rest of the evening passed with quiet conversations, stories by the fire, and gentle laughter from the younger children. Elias listened to legends of the tribe, tales of ancestors, stories of the land before fences and roads were built. It was a world he never stepped into before, yet tonight it welcomed him warmly. Some warriors approached him politely, offering small signs of gratitude, a respectful nod, a gentle word, a gesture over the heart. He didn't understand all their words, but gratitude didn't need translation. As the fire grew lower and the stars filled the sky, Talon leaned against Elias, slowly drifting to sleep. His small head rested on Elias's arm, as if he had done it many times before. Elias didn't move. He simply let the child rest, feeling a strong sense of responsibility settle in his heart. Running Hawk noticed and smiled quietly. "He trusts you deeply," the chief said. Elias nodded. "I feel responsible for him now." "Good," the chief replied. "A child needs more than one home. Sometimes the world gives a second home in unexpected places." Elias thought about that long after the chief walked away. He looked around the camp, the fires, the families, the peaceful air that settled over everything. He knew he was witnessing something rare, understanding between two worlds that often misunderstood each other. For years, Elias had lived alone, believing distance kept him safe. But now he realized something different. Connection brought a different kind of safety, a quiet strength that didn't need fences or guns. Hours later, when the evening finally turned deep into night, Running Hawk stood beside him again. "Tomorrow we leave," he said. "But before we go, we will give you something more." Elias looked up with curiosity. "Something that will stay with you far beyond tonight," the chief continued. "Something that shows your place among us." He didn't explain further. Instead, he placed a hand on Talon's sleeping shoulder, then gave Elias one last, steady, grateful look. When the chief walked away, Elias looked down at the carved symbol in his hand. He held it tightly. He didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. Saving Talon had changed everything. He was no longer just a cowboy living alone. He was part of something bigger now, something that felt like family, like trust, like a bond that wouldn't break easily. Tonight had revealed the hidden truth behind Talon's disappearance, and tomorrow, Elias would learn the truth about the role he had unknowingly stepped into, a role that connected him deeply to the future of the tribe, the chief, and the boy, sleeping peacefully at his side. The next morning came quietly, with soft light touching the tops of the hills and the cold air slowly warming around the edges. Elias woke before most of the camp stirred. Talon was still sleeping beside him, curled warmly under a thick blanket the tribe had given him the night before. Elias sat up carefully so he wouldn't wake the child. As he looked around, he noticed small movements beginning. Women preparing fires, a few warriors checking their horses, some young boys carrying water. The camp was gentle in the early morning, peaceful and steady. Elias stood and stretched, feeling his back tighten from sleeping on the ground, but he didn't mind. Something about being here, being surrounded by this community, felt strangely comforting. He was used to being alone, waking up to empty silence. But today, he woke to a world filled with quiet life, warm smells, and a sense of belonging he never expected. A warrior approached him with a respectful nod. "Chief Running Hawk waits for you," the man said. Elias nodded and followed. Talon, though still sleepy, rose and hurried to walk beside him, holding the cowboy's hand as if he feared being separated. Elias gave his hand a gentle squeeze to reassure him. Running Hawk stood near a small fire on a raised piece of land overlooking the whole camp. He greeted Elias with calm dignity. "Good morning," the chief said. "Today we leave. But before we go, there is something that must be done." Elias noticed several elders gathering nearby, forming a half-circle around the chief. Their expressions were solemn but warm. Talon stepped closer to his grandfather, yet he refused to release Elias's hand, as if both worlds, his own people and the cowboy, were equally important to him now. Running Hawk gestured for Elias to step forward. "Last night we gave you a mark of honor," he said, "but today we offer something deeper." Elias felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure what this meant or what the chief expected of him. Still, he trusted the chief enough to approach. "Before you came into our camp," the chief continued, "you were a stranger, a man living alone on the land. But the moment you lifted that child from danger, you stepped into a different path." The elders nodded in agreement. Talon looked up at Elias proudly, as if he already knew what was coming. Running Hawk reached for something wrapped in soft leather. He unfolded it gently, revealing a small necklace made from woven horsehair and shaped wooden beads. In the center hung a carved figure, the same symbol Elias had received the night before, but this one was larger, more detailed, more meaningful. "This," Running Hawk explained, "is worn only by those our people call guardians of the young, a protector, a friend of our blood." Elias blinked with surprise. I don't know what to say," he admitted quietly. "You do not need many words," the chief said. "Your actions already spoke." Talon stepped forward with both hands open. "Grandfather wants me to give it to you," he said softly. Elias knelt down to the child's height. Talon placed the necklace over his head with gentle care. Elias felt the beads rest against his chest, warm from the boy's hands. The moment the necklace settled, the elders bowed their heads slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he now carried a trusted place among them. Running Hawk spoke again. "This does not tie you to us forever," he said. "You are free, always, but it means that wherever you walk with our respect. And if your path ever crosses danger, know that 200 warriors will not forget the man who protected their future." Elias felt a quiet shock at those words. Not fear, but a deep sense of honor. "Thank you," he said finally, feeling the weight of the necklace against his heart. "I'm proud to carry this." Talon smiled widely, his eyes filled with warmth. "Now you are family to me," he whispered. Elias placed a hand gently on Talon's shoulder. "And you're family to me, too," he said with sincerity. The chief nodded approvingly. "Good. The bond between you two is strong. We respect it." He looked out across the camp as more warriors prepared to leave. "Our people will now return to our land. But before we go, you will ride with us part of the way." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Ride with you?" Running Hawk smiled softly. "Yes. You saved one of ours. Now for a short time, we walk together as one." It wasn't a request. It was an invitation, a bridge between lives. Elias accepted. The tribe began to move shortly after sunrise. Horses were saddled, supplies packed, fires extinguished. The camp that had filled the land with noise and life the day before slowly transformed into an organized procession ready to return home. Elias was given a gentle, calm mare to ride. Talon rode with his grandfather for a while, holding the chief's waist. But after a few minutes, Talon asked quietly if he could ride with Elias instead. The chief allowed it with a nod. Talon climbed up onto Elias's horse with practiced ease, settling in front of him. Elias held the reins gently while Talon leaned back against his chest, relaxed and smiling. Elias couldn't help but smile too. As they rode together, the land stretched wide and open before them. The sun climbed higher, casting gold over the hills. The line of warriors moved like a river, steady and strong. Elias felt the energy around him, not threatening but protective, proud, united. No one rushed, no one argued. The ride was peaceful, filled with the sound of hooves, wind, and soft conversation between families. Talon pointed at different landmarks. "That is where my people hunt," he explained, "and there is where we gather water. Over there, my grandfather taught me how to track footprints." Elias listened patiently, encouraging the boy to keep talking. The child's excitement made him forget the fear he had lived through only a day earlier. After about an hour, the tribe slowed to a halt at a wide, flat rise overlooking a valley. Running Hawk signaled everyone to stop. The chief then rode closer to Elias. "This is where our paths separate," the chief said gently. "Our home lies beyond that ridge. Your home lies behind you." Elias looked down at Talon, who was suddenly quiet. The boy didn't want this moment to come. "You can visit," Talon whispered. "My grandfather will allow it." Elias smiled slightly. "I'd like that someday." Running Hawk spoke softly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who led with wisdom. "Elias Grant, cowboy of these lands, today you ride with friends." He placed a hand on Elias's arm. "If you ever need help, send a signal. 3 fires in a row on a high hill. My people will come." Elias felt deeply humbled. "I hope I never cause you trouble," he said lightly. "You won't," the chief replied, "because your heart is steady." Talon suddenly wrapped his arms around Elias tightly. "Thank you," the child whispered, voice trembling just a little. "For saving me." Elias held him gently. "Stay strong, Talon, and stay safe." Running Hawk lifted Talon back onto his own horse. The child's eyes stayed locked on Elias as long as possible. Then the chief raised his hand in farewell. The warriors did the same, a silent wave that looked like a rising wall of respect. Elias watched as the long line of riders moved toward the ridge, growing smaller and smaller against the morning sky. Talon turned and waved until he could no longer be seen. Slowly, the tribe vanished into the distance. The valley returned to silence. Elias stood alone again, but it was not the same kind of loneliness he had always known. Something had changed inside him. Something had settled, like a seed planted deep within his heart. He looked down at the carved necklace on his chest. It felt warm, alive, meaningful. When he rode back to his ranch, the land didn't feel empty anymore. A quiet strength followed him. A peaceful promise stayed with him. And though he returned to an empty house, he didn't feel alone. From that day forward, people in town whispered about the cowboy who carried the trust of a whole tribe. Some didn't believe it. Some were amazed. But no one questioned the mysterious figures, warriors on distant hills, who seemed to watch over his land from time to time. Elias never asked them why they came. He didn't need to. He knew, because once, on a cold night, he saved a starving child. And by the next morning, 200 warriors had stood outside his barn, not for war, but for gratitude. It was the beginning of a bond that lasted for years, a quiet friendship between a cowboy and a nation of people who saw his heart clearly from the very first moment he lifted that child into his arms.